learn about the battlefield in which we're going to be playing the game of chess on, and how the pieces move, and all the other basic rules and principles we're going to take out of this video lecture. A little bit of a history. Chess has been around for as long as just about any other board game, with the earliest versions dating back to 600 AD in Persia and India, believe it or not. And the modern versions of the game that we play today, let's say tournament chess, have been around since roughly the 15th century and was popularized in Europe. The game of chess is played on a 64-square checker board, a board that alternates between light and dark colored squares. You can say white and green, or in many cases white and black, but light and dark is the most common terms used to describe the rotating or alternating colors on a chessboard. There's basic terminology that you need to know in order to be a chess player. This will help you when reading materials or watching video lectures on our site, as well as just the terms you should use to describe the movements of your own pieces. The first one is rank. Rank is a term we use to describe the side-to-side direction in chess, this being the 6th rank, the 4th rank, and here the 2nd rank, so on and so forth. The next term you need to know is file. File is a term we use to describe the up and down directions of a chessboard, with this being the C file, the first one I highlighted being the E file, the G file, the H file, and so on and so forth. The third and final direction that any one piece can move on a chessboard is a diagonal. Diagonal is a term we use to cut across the board like so, with rank and file being the terms we use to describe the straight, up and down, lateral, and longitude directions. Diagonal is a side-to-side cut across direction, with this being the B1 H7 diagonal, the H1 A8 diagonal, the A2 to G8 diagonal, and so on and so forth. You've noticed as I described the basic terminology of rank, file, and diagonal, I was using the letters and numbers you see directly beneath and to the side to the left of your chessboard. These numbers are known as algebraic coordinates, and they're used to write down chess notation or to keep score in a tournament game. These letters and numbers are used to help us keep track of chess notation. Every move has an address, a note that can be recorded. Every square has a location and a name that we use to refer to it, with this square being E6, this square being C4, here we have G2, C7, B2, H5, and so on and so forth. Notice that we always say the letter first, H, and then the number, 5, whenever we're describing a chessboard or move. A couple quick examples of how we would write down a chess move. Here the rook is on C5, and if it moved to C7, we would use a capital R, and then the location that the piece landed on. Currently, this king resides on D3, and if it moved to E4, we would write a capital K, and then write the square E4. For the knight, though knight starts with the letter K, we use N in chess as the K is already reserved by the Royal Highness. In this case, we would write N to E3, capital N E3. When it comes to moving the pawn, typically all you need to write is the square the pawn lands on, in this case G5 as you see here. Some players, especially younger players when they first learn the game, like to use a capital P as they use with the other pieces in order to avoid confusion. We would use a capital B for bishop and a capital Q for queen, and so on and so forth. Now that we've learned the basic terminology used to describe the 64-square battlefield that we play the game of kings on, let's meet all the players and learn how a chessboard is set up to its initial starting classical position. We will start first with His Majesty, with the king starting always on the opposite color square of their army, with the white king starting on a dark square and the black king starting on a light square. The position of the kings is always easy to remember when we learn the starting position of the queens, as the queens are the opposite. They must always start on their own color, with the white queen starting on a white square and the black queen starting on a dark square. Continuing to move from the center first toward the edge of the board, let's add the bishops, the protectors of the royal family. Here we see the bishops start on F1 and C1 for white, and F8 and C8 for black. Next, we will add the knights, the ponies, the noble steeds. The knights start directly between the bishops, and the last piece we're going to add, you'll see, is the rooks, the castles, the towers of power. Knights start out for white on G1 and B1, and for black on G8 and B8. And finally, we see the towers of power bringing up the rear, starting on the edge of the board, the rooks being the most powerful pieces directly behind the queen. They start out on H1 and A1 for white, H8 and A8 for black. Finally, we see the pawns, the little guys, complete the setup of a classical chess game. All the pawns for white start out on the 2nd rank. All the pawns for black start on the 7th rank, according to algebraic notation. Before we move on to learning how the pieces move, there is one last important piece of chess terminology that everyone needs to know. When the board is set up, it is often referred to as being split into two areas, the king side and the queen side. The king side is everything from the E file over to the H file, essentially the side of the board that the king is closest to. The queen side is everything from the D file to the A file, essentially everything that the queen is closest to. This is important, and as we get into the later portions of this video, you'll notice that when we describe castling, there are options to castle both king side and queen side. Remember this terminology as it'll help you understand what authors are referring to when they're describing plans and strategies on certain areas of the board. Now that we've learned how to set up a chessboard and we've met most of the players, let's take a deeper look into how each piece moves, as well as learn the value, or let's say relative value, of each respective chessman. Each chess piece has a given value, and these are to serve as guidelines as you make decisions throughout every game you play. When introducing the pieces, stating their value, and teaching their movements, each coach may have a different strategy. I like to teach with the easiest piece to learn first and move backwards towards the most complex. You may be surprised in which order that is. First, let's start with the rook. Here we see a rook on e4, and we learn that the rook is a powerful piece that moves along the straight lines of a chessboard. The straight lines, we already learned, are the ranks and the files. A rook can move in one direction at one time on a rank or a file. So in this position, the rook has the option to move to any square along the E file and any square along the 4th rank. As long as it is not obstructed by its own army or the enemy army, the rook can move as far as he wants in any one direction on the straight lines of the chessboard, and he is worth 5 points. The bishop is in many respects the polar opposite of the rook. The bishop is not allowed to move along the ranks or the files, ever, and its only legal movement is along the diagonal of the color it currently sits on. In this position, for example, this bishop could move to any square along the B1, H7 diagonal, or any square along the H1, A8 diagonal. A bishop that starts on a certain color, as we learned with the bishop starting on F1 and C1, must stay on that color for the entire game, as it only moves diagonally and will never have an option to move along a straight line to change colors. Quickly, as we state the value of the bishops here as 3 points, we will remind you that you have 2 bishops of each color to start the game. You have 1 bishop on the dark square and 1 bishop on a light square. Both of these pieces will be stuck to that color square for the entire remainder of the chess game. The next and perhaps easiest piece to understand is Her Royal Highness herself, the Queen, the First Lady of Chess. Essentially, the Queen is a rook and bishop combined. She moves along the files, the ranks, the diagonals, and as long as she is not obstructed by any one of her own pieces or one of the enemies, her scope extends to the far corners of the chessboard on almost any square that she stands on. The queen is worth 9 points, essentially the cumulative sum of a rook and bishop as 8 points, plus an extra 1, as the queen has the ability, when she moves like a rook, to switch from a light squared bishop to a dark squared bishop. So rather than being worth only 8, the queen is essentially worth 9, which is again 1 more point higher than the cumulative sum of the rook and the bishop. She's the most powerful piece, though not the most valuable piece, as we'll learn about the king right now. The king, though limited in his mobility, is the most valuable piece because he does not even have a value. Can be said that the king is worth infinity. The king is worth the entire chessboard. Some have even said the king is worth more than your mother. Totally joking. Just relax. In any case, the king can only move in one square at a time, but in any one direction he chooses. Much like a queen, however, limited by only one square at a time. The king can move from this position to d5, to e5, to f5, and so on and so forth. The king is the most valuable piece because you are unable to trade him. It is not an option to trade him for any other piece. A king starts the game and is one of the only pieces guaranteed to be on the board when the game is finished. The king cannot be traded, but he can only be trapped. That is known as checkmate, which we'll get to at the end of this video as the goal of every chess game you play. So again, your king is the most valuable piece you own. You can list him as valuable as the 64 square battlefield that you play on, and he moves it one square at a time in any one direction. The final two pieces to learn are perhaps the most tricky. The knight is the one piece that does not fall under the category of moving either straight on a rank, file, or diagonal, as every other piece does. The knight has an awkward movement that is often referred to as a capital L or boot shape. A knight in the center of the board is best placed because it has access to the entire area of the board. When the knight moves, you can often draw two lines that would look much like a boot or a capital L. So often that term is used when teaching children how to play the game, as the knight can be a tricky piece to master at first. As